situations along the lines of, "Wait, you weren't kidding?" The story of The Room of Forgotten Faces. Our friend was always a little strange. He was different from the rest of us in the way he dressed, talked, joked. Often we perceived him as someone who just liked to be different, but there was one thing he mentioned more often than any other: his collection of antique dolls. At first, it seemed like just another joke contributing to his image as a weirdo. We laughed at his stories without giving them much thought. Neither of us believed it could be true. Every time we met, he found a way to insert a story about his special collection into the conversation. We thought it was just his way of getting attention, of generating interest. None of us took him seriously. But one day, one cold fall evening, he invited us to his home. The offer immediately made us smile. Finally, we would find out what kind of dolls he supposedly collects. Everyone expected to see a couple of old toys scattered on shelves for effect. But what we saw changed our perception of this man forever. We pulled up to his house, which was in an old section of town amongst neglected and abandoned buildings. The door creaked open as he invited us in. There was a strange atmosphere in the house, a silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath, awaiting our visit. We were escorted through a long corridor, lit by a dim light that only added to the unsettling sensation. He stopped in front of the door that led to one of the rooms and invited us in with a mysterious smile. When the door opened, we were confronted with something that sent chills down our spines. The room was littered with dolls, hundreds, if not thousands of antique dolls. They were everywhere, on shelves, on tables, in the corners of the room. Their empty, glassy eyes stared at us from every direction. Their faces, faded by time, were frozen in an expression of eternal horror. Some of the dolls were hairless, others had cracked porcelain faces, their clothes dusty and worn. They seemed to be looking straight into our souls, studying us just as we were trying to understand their master. Many of the dolls were strange, with unnaturally large eyes, grotesque facial features, and deformed bodies. Each one seemed to have been chosen not for their beauty, but for the creepiness that lurked behind their broken parts and shabby dresses. The room was permeated with a heavy odor of old age and mustiness that reinforced the feeling that we were trapped in other people's memories and nightmares. No one knew what to say. We stood in absolute silence while our friend proudly showed off his collection, calling the dolls by name and telling their stories. Each doll, he said, had its own destiny, its own mystery, its own secret that he tried to unravel by collecting them from various collectors and flea markets. We realized that what we were looking at was not just a collection of antiques. It was a part of his inner world, which until that moment had remained closed to us. What we thought was a strange joke turned out to be a reality that made us uncomfortable. The longer we stayed in that room, the stronger the feeling became that we weren't supposed to be here. We could feel these dolls looking at us as if they were waiting for something. Our friend continued to tell us about each of them, but we were no longer listening. A desire was growing inside to leave this place as quickly as possible. When we finally left his house, each of us was silent. We couldn't find words to describe the horror we had just experienced. We now knew that there was something more behind the mask of the weirdo, and this knowledge inspired fear. After that visit, our attitude toward him changed. We no longer laughed at his jokes about dolls and tried not to talk about it. The story of finger space. Usually, she made reservations in advance so as not to risk being without her favorite place, but this time it was different. She appeared at the reception unexpectedly, without any prior call. Her appearance was impeccable as always, and the confidence in her eyes seemed to know no bounds. When she approached the counter, I already knew what she was going to ask. The service program showed that her favorite room was already taken, but there were plenty of other available rooms in the hotel. However, I wasn't expecting what she would say next. After a brief greeting, she uttered, "I need my room." There was no doubt on her face that her request would be honored. I explained that unfortunately the number was already taken, but offered her other options. Her face remained calm, but there was a slight irritation in her eyes. And then she said something that made me freeze. "Oh, well, call the guests of this room and tell them to move out so I can check in." I seriously thought it was a joke. Playing along with her, I smiled and said, "Yes, "Yep, I'll figure it out now," while typing her information into the computer. We often joked around with regular guests, and this would have been one of those situations if not for her follow-up question. She looked at me carefully, as if assessing how seriously I was taking her words. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, she added, "Aren't you going to call them?" At that moment, I realized she wasn't kidding. Her request was sincere and serious. She really expected me to do her bidding. Thoughts flashed through my mind as to how it was possible to get to this level of confidence in my exceptionalism. Of course, I couldn't do what she asked, but the realization of her expectation shocked me. I tried to calmly explain that unfortunately, I couldn't ask the guests to move out as it would be against the rules, but she remained adamant. Her face expressed incomprehension and even resentment, as if I had broken some unspoken agreement. It was hard for me to understand how a person could so confidently demand something so absurd. Finally, after a few minutes of persuasion, she gave in and agreed to another number, but her disappointment was visible to the naked eye. She looked at me with such coldness that I felt a slight discomfort. It seemed that in her world I was no longer a benevolent employee, but an obstacle in her way. Story about strength testing. It was an ordinary corporate party. All colleagues gathered in a cozy restaurant hall to celebrate the successful completion of the project. The atmosphere was light and relaxed. Food and drinks were mingling on the tables, and laughter and conversation were in the air. Some of the employees had been chatting amongst themselves for a while now, sharing jokes and discussing the latest news from the office. The company was mostly made up of seasoned professionals, but there was one colleague who was always particularly eccentric. This man, Adrian, had recently purchased a new phone, which he said was equipped with perfect waterproof protection. Even before the party started, he managed to tell everyone about how his new device would survive any weather, how he could dive into the pool with it, or even record video underwater. No one paid much attention to it because in the middle of the corporate party, such conversation seemed insignificant. However, at some point, when the degree of fun began to grow, Adrian again reminded everyone about his new acquisition. It seemed that he was sincerely passionate about the topic of water protection, and this caused a slight smile from the others. But things soon took an unexpected turn. At one point, Adrian picked up a glass of bright orange juice and, with a mysterious smile on his face, said that he was going to check if his new phone was really that waterproof. Colleagues just looked at him, thinking it was just another joke, but no one could have predicted that he would actually do it. Without thinking long, Adrian dipped his phone into a glass of juice. It became quiet at once. Everyone was watching with surprise and slight bewilderment. No one knew how to react to it. Some thought it was part of some prank. Some expected him to pull out the phone and demonstrate its perfect work, but nothing of the sort happened. The seconds dragged on slowly. Everyone watched as the phone gradually sank into the viscous orange juice, while Adrian waited with smug confidence for the result. His face expressed genuine faith in technological marvels, but soon something went wrong. The phone's screen began to blink, then darkened abruptly. Adrian quickly pulled it out of the glass and began shaking it, hoping it was just a minor hiccup, but the phone wouldn't turn on again. Juice seeped into every crevice, shattering any dreams of waterproofing. Story about waiting for the impossible. In a quiet neighborhood where every morning seemed the same and the streets rarely saw rushing cars, lived an elderly woman named Amelia. Her life was measured and simple, but her heart was always full of love for her dog, a small poodle named Richie. This pet was not just a friend, but her only link to a world that was becoming less and less accessible with each passing year. After her husband died and the children moved out, Richie became the one who was there for Amelia every day, on a walk in the park, in the evening by the fireplace, and at night when the wind rumbled outside the window. One day, however, Amelia's world was shaken when trouble struck Richie. Not long ago, he was running merrily around the yard, chasing birds and giving his owner a paw. But then a sudden illness, or perhaps an injury, changed his life drastically. The vets gave Amelia the terrible news. The dog's leg had to be amputated to save his life. This news shook her to the core. After the surgery, Richie returned home on 3 legs. He was still the same affectionate and loyal dog, but Amelia couldn't help but notice how his appearance had changed. She could see his confusion and felt a sense of longing in her heart. Even though the doctors had explained to her that the dog would be able to adjust to his new life, Amelia Amelia's heart couldn't take it so easily. She wanted to believe in a miracle. Every day she lovingly cared for her pet, but her thoughts kept coming back to the question that kept her on her mind. When will Richie's leg grow back? Amelia had never experienced anything like this in her life, and her naive belief that time could heal any wound was strong. Every time she stroked Richie and noticed the absence of one paw, she hoped that it was only temporary, that sooner or later, nature would fix it. Her conviction was not based on knowledge, but on a deep affection for her pet and a desire to give him back his former life. Weeks passed. Richie gradually began to adapt to the new reality, learned to move on 3 legs, although at times it was difficult for him. But Amelia still waited impatiently for a miracle. Every morning when she got up, her first act was to see if the dog had a new paw. She examined the amputation site, hoping to see even the slightest hint of growth in the new limb. People in the neighborhood, seeing Amelia walking her 3-legged dog with care and concern, sometimes stopped to talk to her or pet Richie, but Amelia tried not to notice their pitying looks. She continued to believe that all was not yet lost. Her care for the dog was becoming not just a routine, but a ritual of waiting for a miracle. One day, during one of those walks, a woman from the neighboring house came up to her and, stroking Richie, asked how he was feeling after the surgery. It was a simple, friendly question, but there was a reality lurking in it that Amelia still didn't want to face. She told the woman about how she was looking forward to her favorite pet's paw growing back. The neighbor faltered for a moment, her face expressing surprise and confusion. Instead of shattering Amelia's illusion, however, she simply supported her belief and wished Richie well. Story about dress code on remote work. Working remotely has become a new stage for many company employees. The usual office routine was replaced by a home environment where work desks turned into dining tables and business suits, into comfortable home t-shirts and pajamas. No one complained, everyone was comfortable, and for the most part, the remote format allowed employees to remain productive while enjoying a home-like atmosphere. However, there was one important detail in this new reality: corporate meetings via Skype. For most employees, they had become a routine part of the day. There was a regular meeting that day that I was a little late for. As usual, the Skype session started without many surprises, but when I finally connected, colleagues were already involved in the discussion. Once I got into the chat room, the feeling was pretty familiar. Noise from the keyboards, focused faces, and occasional jokes in between serious discussions. My boss, who always had her finger on the pulse of corporate norms and standards, was just saying something, but I didn't manage to catch the gist of her speech. In order not to fall out of the process, I immediately asked my colleagues to summarize what I had missed. One of my teammates, Alex, known for his jokes and irony, reported with his usual ease. The supervisor just announced that we are now required to follow work uniforms even when working from home. When I heard that, I literally laughed out loud. And it wasn't just a light laugh. It was a real explosion of laughter that shook my body. I imagined this picture: the whole office sitting at home in their suits and ties over their pajamas or shorts. At that moment, the thought seemed so absurd that I didn't hold back. I wiped the tears from my eyes and continued laughing, already realizing that someone would soon join my fun. "Alex, this is just hilarious," I exclaimed, still choking with laughter. "Can you imagine if we were really sitting at home in our uniforms?" But to my surprise, instead of cheering my hilarity, the entire screen remained dark and silent. None of my coworkers shared my enthusiasm. No one even smiled. I glanced at the screen. Not a single camera was on, and the room was silent. Usually at moments like this, someone would pick up on the joke, or at least show a slight laugh, but not this time. I tried to figure out what was wrong. This moment took forever. I felt the awkwardness slowly building up. The silence continued. My supervisor, whose name Alex had mentioned, now seemed to be watching my every move, though I couldn't see her face. On the screen, her microphone suddenly turned on, and I realized that something unexpected was about to follow. In the next moment, she informed me in a cold tone, "Yes, we are indeed considering a new norm of enforcing a corporate dress code, even when working remotely. This applies to all employees, no exceptions." The story about the neighbor who's no longer there. On a quiet street among simple one-story houses lived my neighbor Jack. He was a man in his 40s, not very social, but always polite. We rarely crossed paths, but I knew a little about his life. He was divorced and lived alone, but sometimes his daughter, a student, would come to visit him on weekends or holidays. Usually at such times, the house would come alive. Voices were heard, laughter, and even the music seemed to get louder. One warm weekend afternoon, I noticed a small family gathering in Jack's backyard. Several people were standing around, talking and laughing, while Jack himself, as usual, kept a little to the side but engaged in conversation with the guests. I was glad to see him in good spirits, for he had seemed a little distant lately. Toward evening, I needed one small thing, some sort of tool that I knew I could ask Jack for. I walked out of the house and headed for his door. When I walked up and knocked, the door was opened by his daughter, a young girl with slightly tired eyes but still friendly, albeit a little pensive. I smiled and asked her to get her father. Her face suddenly changed. She looked at me with surprise and pain before she said quietly and seriously, "My father is dead." The words sounded so unexpected that I chuckled automatically. Of course, it had to be a misunderstanding. I'd just seen him in the yard a few minutes ago. Chuckling slightly, I said something like, "Yeah, sure," but her look didn't change. She stood motionless, as if my words had hit her somewhere deeper than I could have imagined. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly turned away, running off into the back of the house. I was left standing on the doorstep, not realizing what had just happened. I felt embarrassed, but before I could process what had just happened, the door opened again. This time it was her mother, Jack's ex-wife, who appeared on the doorstep. The woman looked at me with sadness and weariness, but her eyes no longer held the confusion I'd seen in her daughter's. With a quiet sigh, she explained, "Jack did die a few months ago. The man you saw is his brother. They look very much alike." At that moment, I felt a wave of shame and remorse wash over me. All my thoughts became confused. How could I have been so wrong? I thought back to those moments when I had stood at the window and watched the fun in the courtyard. I was sure I had seen my neighbor. Their faces had indeed resembled each other in every detail, and I had never doubted for a second that it was him. Now, the mistake seemed monstrous. I felt terrible realizing that my careless words had hurt people who were just beginning to come to terms with their loss. This family was going through a difficult time, and I, not knowing all the details, had only added to their grief with my joke.